They called it slop. They called it garbage. Some called it worse things, words that would have gotten them disciplined if an officer had been within earshot. The Marines of 2nd Battalion, 28th Regiment, 5th Marine Division, stared at the mixture their battalion cook had prepared, and they were not impressed. It was the afternoon of February 23rd, 1945, on the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, and Staff Sergeant Louis Burmeister had just committed what many of his fellow Marines considered an act of culinary treason. He had taken their C-ration cans, the carefully calculated meals that had been designed by nutritionists and tested by the Quartermaster Corps, and he had dumped them all together into a single container. Meat and beans mixed with ham and lima beans, cheese mixed with crackers ground into powder, instant coffee stirred into the whole mess along with sugar packets and powdered lemon juice. The result looked like something that belonged in a latrine, not in a mess kit. It smelled strange, a combination of conflicting flavors that should never have met. And it was thick, so thick you could almost eat it with your fingers if you had been desperate enough or hungry enough to try. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Burmeister stood beside his makeshift cooking position, a hole scraped in the volcanic ash with a heat source improvised from fuel tablets, and he watched the men's reactions. He was 31 years old, which made him ancient by Marine Corps standards, where most riflemen were barely out of their teens. He had been a cook in civilian life, working in a diner in Milwaukee, Wisconsin before the war. He knew food. He knew what people would eat and what they would refuse, and he knew that what he had just created looked absolutely terrible. But he also knew something else, something that none of the Marines complaining about his concoction understood yet. He knew they were going to need every calorie they could get. He knew the supply situation was worse than anyone was admitting. He knew the casualties had been so heavy in the first 3 days of the assault that medical supplies were being prioritized over food. He knew that ammunition was running low and that every landing craft that made it to shore was carrying shells and bullets, not rations. And he knew that the men were going to be fighting, climbing, crawling, and dying on this miserable island for days to come without regular resupply. So he had made a decision. He had taken the individual rations, each one designed to be eaten separately over the course of a day, and he had combined them into something that could be eaten quickly, that could be carried easily, that would not spoil in the heat, and that would provide maximum calories in minimum volume. He had created what he privately thought of as survival paste, though he would never call it that to the men. They already hated it enough. One Marine, a corporal from Ohio, whose name Burmeister did not know, took a cautious taste from his mess kit. His face contorted. He spat into the volcanic sand. "Sarge, this tastes like you mixed every bad thing in the ration and made it worse." Other men laughed. Bitter, exhausted laughter that had nothing to do with humor. They were filthy, covered in black volcanic ash that stuck to their sweat and turned them into dark ghosts. They were exhausted from 3 days of combat that had been more brutal than anything they had trained for. They were scared, though none would admit it, because Mount Suribachi loomed behind them, and the Japanese were dug into every cave and bunker ahead of them. And now their cook had served them something that looked and tasted like punishment. Burmeister said nothing. He had been in the Marines long enough to know that arguing with riflemen was pointless. They would eat it, or they would not. But he had made enough of the mixture to feed 200 men for 6 days, and he had stored it in every container he could find, because he had a feeling, a cook's intuition built from years of feeding people and watching supply chains, that they were going to need it. He was right. He was more right than he could possibly have known on that February afternoon. and in 6 days, the Marines who had cursed his cooking would be alive because of it, while men in other units who had stuck to eating their rations the proper way would be dead from starvation, exhaustion, or the simple inability to function in combat without adequate nutrition. But that realization was still in the future. For now, all anyone knew was that their cook had made something stupid, something that violated every principle of proper military ration preparation, something that no one wanted to eat. They were wrong about it being stupid. They would learn that soon enough. The science of feeding soldiers in combat had evolved considerably by 1945, but it remained an imperfect art balanced between nutrition, preservation, weight, and practicality. The United States Army Quartermaster Corps had spent years developing rations that could sustain men in every climate and combat situation imaginable. Each type of ration had been carefully designed, tested on volunteers, analyzed by nutritionists, and produced by the millions in factories across the United States. The C-ration, which formed the basis of Staff Sergeant Burmeister's controversial mixture, had been introduced in 1938 as a replacement for the earlier reserve ration. It was designed to provide one complete meal in a single can, though in practice it came as a set of components. The M unit, or meat unit, contained the main course, meat and beans, meat and vegetable hash, meat and vegetable stew, ham and lima beans, or one of several other combinations. Each meat unit provided approximately 900 calories and was packed in a cylindrical can weighing roughly 1 pound. The B unit, or bread unit, contained crackers or biscuits, a small amount of candy or a dessert component, sugar tablets, and sometimes powdered coffee or lemon juice. This unit added another 400 to 500 calories. Together, a complete C-ration meal provided approximately 1,400 calories, which was calculated to be sufficient for 1/3 of a soldier's daily nutritional needs. 3 C-ration meals per day would provide 4,200 calories, which military nutritionists had determined was the minimum necessary for men engaged in sustained combat operations. The calculations were precise. Military researchers had studied caloric expenditure in combat conditions and had determined that infantry soldiers engaged in active operations burned between 4,500 and 6,000 calories per day. Men carrying heavy equipment, climbing steep terrain, digging fortifications, or engaged in direct combat could burn even more. The rations were designed to provide adequate nutrition while remaining portable, enough for men to carry several days' worth in their packs. But there were problems with the system, problems that became apparent only in sustained combat under difficult conditions. The first problem was weight. A single day's worth of C-rations, 3 complete meals, weighed approximately 6 pounds. 3 days of rations weighed 18 pounds. A week's worth weighed over 40 pounds, which was more than a rifleman could reasonably carry along with his weapon, ammunition, water, and other essential equipment. In practice, Marines on Iwo Jima carried at most 2 days of rations, often less. The second problem was time. Eating a proper C-ration meal took time. The cans had to be opened, which required a small can opener that was easily lost. The contents had to be heated if possible, which required fuel and a few minutes of relative safety. The components had to be consumed separately, which meant stopping, sitting down, and taking time away from combat operations. In the intense fighting on Iwo Jima, where Japanese artillery could land anywhere at any time, and where every piece of terrain was contested, taking 15 or 20 minutes to properly eat a meal was a luxury many men could not afford. The third problem was waste. Each C-ration component came in its own can. After eating, soldiers were left with empty metal containers that had to be disposed of or carried. On an island where every square yard was under observation and where discarded cans could reveal positions to enemy artillery spotters, this created a tactical problem. Men buried their empty cans in the volcanic ash, but this took time and effort. The fourth problem was palatability. The C-rations had been designed to be nutritionally adequate, not delicious. Some components were tolerable. The meat and beans were generally accepted as edible, though bland. The ham and lima beans were universally despised, so much so that they were nicknamed ham and mothers by Marines who could not bring themselves to eat them except under extreme hunger. The crackers were dry and tasteless. The cheese was rubbery and often rancid in tropical heat. After days or weeks of eating the same limited menu, men became so sick of the taste that they would skip meals rather than force down another can of hash. Military planners knew about these problems. The Quartermaster Corps had received thousands of complaints from soldiers in the field. Researchers had conducted studies on ration fatigue, the psychological condition where men became so tired of eating the same foods that their caloric intake dropped below sustainable levels even when rations were available. Various solutions had been proposed: more variety in ration components, better flavoring, improved packaging. But changing the ration system required retooling factories, retraining supply personnel, and distributing new rations throughout a global war effort. It was a massive undertaking that could not happen quickly. So the Marines who landed on Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945, carried the same C-rations that had been issued since the early days of the war. They had the same components, the same flavors, the same problems. And they faced a situation where those problems would become critical. Because Iwo Jima was different from previous campaigns. It was more intense, more concentrated, more brutal in its demands on the men fighting there. And the supply situation, despite careful planning, was about to become desperate. Iwo Jima was 8 square miles of volcanic rock and ash located approximately 750 miles south of Tokyo. It was strategically vital because it sat directly under the flight path that American B-29 bombers used to reach Japanese cities from bases in the Mariana Islands. Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima could intercept the bombers. American fighters based on Iwo Jima could escort them. The island also housed 2 completed airfields and a third under construction, facilities that could serve as emergency landing sites for damaged bombers returning from raids over Japan. The American military command knew the Japanese would defend Iwo Jima with everything they had. Intelligence estimates suggested a garrison of approximately 13,000 troops. The actual number was closer to 21,000. These defenders were not the garrison troops that had been encountered on some other islands. They were veteran soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army, many with combat experience from China or the Pacific campaigns. They were commanded by Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, one of the most capable officers in the Japanese military. Kuribayashi had spent months preparing Iwo Jima's defenses. He had abandoned the traditional Japanese tactic of defending at the water's edge and attempting to destroy the invasion force during the landing. Instead, he had constructed an elaborate system of underground fortifications. 11 miles of tunnels connected bunkers, command posts, artillery positions, and troop shelters. Positions were reinforced with concrete and steel. Gun emplacements were carefully sited to provide interlocking fields of fire. Everything was dug in, hidden, and designed to survive naval bombardment and air strikes. The American plan called for 3 Marine divisions to land simultaneously on the southeastern beaches of the island. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine divisions, approximately 70,000 men, would come ashore under the cover of the most massive pre-invasion bombardment yet delivered in the Pacific War. Naval gunfire from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers would pulverize the Japanese defenses. Carrier aircraft would strike any remaining positions. Then the Marines would land, secure the beaches, capture the airfields, and eliminate the remaining defenders in 5 days of operations. The bombardment began on February 16, 1945. For 3 days, American warships pounded the island. Over 21,000 shells, ranging from 5-inch destroyer rounds to 16-inch battleship projectiles weighing over a ton each, were fired at Japanese positions. Carrier aircraft dropped hundreds of bombs. The island appeared to be destroyed. Its landscape transformed into a moonscape of overlapping craters. Intelligence officers watching from ships believed no one could survive such devastation. They were catastrophically wrong. The Japanese positions, deep underground and heavily reinforced, had survived almost intact. When the Marines landed on the morning of February 19th, they discovered the truth. The beaches were not defended, exactly as Kuribayashi had planned. But once the Marines moved inland, away from the covering fire of the ships, the killing began. Hidden guns opened fire. Artillery zeroed in on the beaches where supplies and equipment were being unloaded. Mortars dropped rounds into the landing craft still approaching shore. Machine guns fired from concealed positions that could not be seen until Marines were within meters of them. The volcanic sand made movement almost impossible. It was not like the sand on other Pacific islands. It was fine black ash, so loose that men sank to their ankles with every step. Vehicles bogged down completely. Tracked landing vehicles that were supposed to carry supplies inland became stuck within meters of the water's edge. Men carrying heavy equipment exhausted themselves within minutes. The simple act of walking required constant effort. Running was nearly impossible. And all of this happened under continuous fire from an enemy that could not be seen. Staff Sergeant Louis Burmeister had not planned to be a military cook. He had been drafted in December 1942 at the age of 29, already older than most of the men entering service. Before the war, he had worked at a small diner on Mitchell Street in Milwaukee, a place that served breakfast and lunch to factory workers and neighborhood residents. He knew how to stretch ingredients when money was tight. He knew how to make filling meals from whatever was available. He understood the relationship between food and morale, how a good meal could change a man's entire day, and how hunger could break down discipline and willpower. The Marine Corps had assigned him to cooking duty based on his civilian experience. He had gone through basic training at Parris Island, then been sent to Cook's and Baker's School at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. The training was thorough. He learned the official procedures for preparing military rations, the sanitation requirements, the paperwork involved in requisitioning supplies. He learned how to operate field kitchens, how to prepare hot meals under combat conditions, how to calculate serving sizes for different units. Everything was standardized, regulated, documented. The Marine Corps had specific ways of doing things, and deviation from those procedures was discouraged. But Burmeister had also served long enough to understand the gap between doctrine and reality. He had been with the 5th Marine Division since its formation at Camp Pendleton in California in January 1944. He had trained with the men, learned their preferences, watched them prepare for combat. He had been at Pendleton when the division conducted practice amphibious landings, working out the logistics of getting food from ships to beaches to men in the field. He had seen how easily supply lines could break down, how quickly plans could fall apart when reality intruded. By February 1945, Burmeister had been on Iwo Jima for 4 days. He had come ashore on D-Day with his unit, establishing a field kitchen near the beaches where he was supposed to prepare hot meals for the men. But the situation had made that impossible. The beaches were under constant artillery fire. The volcanic sand made it impossible to set up proper cooking equipment. Water was scarce, rationed carefully because every drop had to be brought ashore in cans. Fuel for cooking was limited because priority went to vehicles and generators. And the casualties had been so heavy that medical supplies and ammunition took precedence over everything else in the supply chain. He had watched the situation deteriorate day by day. On D-Day, supply had been chaotic but manageable. By D+1, February 20th, it was clear that casualties were far higher than expected, and that the beach area was more dangerous than planned. By D+2, the supply officers were prioritizing ammunition and blood plasma. By D+3, February 22nd, Burmeister realized that regular resupply of rations was not going to happen for the forward units. The men were supposed to be carrying 3 days of rations. Many had consumed most of their food in the first 2 days due to the extreme physical demands of fighting in the volcanic sand. That evening, Burmeister had made his decision. He gathered every C-ration can he could find in his unit supply area, approximately 400 individual components. He commandeered several large metal containers, the kind normally used for water or fuel, and he began mixing. He opened the meat cans and dumped the contents together. He crushed the crackers into powder and added them to the mixture. He stirred in the cheese, the jam, the instant coffee, the sugar, the lemon powder, everything that could provide calories and could be mixed into a thick paste that would not separate or spoil. The mixture was revolting to look at. It smelled strange, a combination of all the different ration components that had never been meant to exist together. But it was dense with calories, perhaps 2,000 calories per pound of mixture. It could be eaten cold without preparation. It could be carried easily in canteen cups or mess kits. It did not require opening multiple cans or taking time to heat components. A man could scoop out a handful, swallow it down with water, and return to fighting within minutes. It was everything that traditional C-rations were not: efficient, portable, quick to consume, and calorie-dense. Burmeister understood that he was violating regulations. The rations were supposed to be issued in their original packaging. They were supposed to be consumed as designed. Mixing them together destroyed the careful nutritional balance that Quartermaster Corps scientists had calculated. It created something that had never been tested, never approved, never authorized by any manual or regulation. If officers found out, he could face disciplinary action. If the mixture made men sick, he could be held responsible. But he also understood something that the regulations did not account for. The men needed food they could actually eat under combat conditions. They needed maximum calories in minimum volume. They needed something that did not require time or equipment to prepare. They needed food that would keep them fighting when resupply failed. And that was exactly what he had created, whether anyone else understood it or not. The supply situation on Iwo Jima continued to deteriorate through late February. The problems were structural, built into the fundamental challenges of the island's geography and the intensity of the fighting. Every aspect of logistics that had worked adequately on previous islands failed here under the combination of volcanic terrain, concentrated enemy fire, and unexpectedly high casualties. The beaches where supplies came ashore were narrow and exposed. Japanese artillery observers on Mount Suribachi and in the highlands could see every landing craft that approached. They could direct fire onto the beach areas where supplies were being unloaded. Shells landed continuously among the piles of ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and equipment. Men assigned to beach-working parties, the unglamorous but essential troops who unloaded supplies and moved them inland, suffered casualties as heavy as frontline infantry in some cases. The volcanic sand made vehicle movement almost impossible. Wheeled trucks sank to their axles and had to be abandoned. Tracked vehicles fared slightly better but consumed fuel at alarming rates just moving short distances. The amphibious tractors, officially called LVTs or landing vehicle tracked, that were supposed to carry supplies from ships to the beaches and then inland, broke down frequently. Their tracks, designed for water and normal sand, could not handle the volcanic ash. Track pins sheared off. Bogie wheels seized. Engines overheated from the fine dust that infiltrated every mechanical system. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Supply officers improvised desperately. They organized human chains of men passing supplies hand to hand from the beach to forward areas. They requisitioned Japanese carts and wheelbarrows found in abandoned villages. They had Marines carry extra loads of ammunition and rations forward when they moved up to relieve units on the line. But none of these measures could keep up with consumption rates. Ammunition expenditure exceeded every previous Pacific campaign. Marines fired more rifle ammunition, threw more grenades, and used more mortar rounds per day than in any previous battle. The Japanese defensive positions required enormous amounts of explosives to destroy. Flamethrowers, satchel charges, and demolitions consumed supplies at rates that had not been anticipated. Every destroyed Japanese bunker required hundreds of pounds of explosives and thousands of rounds of covering fire. Medical supplies were consumed at catastrophic rates. The casualty figures told the story. By the end of the first week of fighting, Marine casualties exceeded 5,000 men killed or wounded. Every wounded man required bandages, plasma, morphine, and medical care. Hospital ships offshore filled to capacity and had to be replaced with fresh vessels. Field hospitals near the beaches operated continuously. Medical supplies took absolute priority in the supply chain because without them, wounded men would die. Food became the third priority after ammunition and medicine. This was a brutal calculation, but a necessary one. A man could survive for days without food, though his combat effectiveness would decline. A man could not survive without ammunition when the enemy was attacking. A man could not survive his wounds without medical care. So rations moved down the priority list, and forward units began to run short. The Marines' 2nd Battalion, 28th Regiment, the unit that had raised the flag on Mount Suribachi on February 23rd, pushed north from the mountain toward the island's center. They moved into terrain that was even worse than the beaches. The ground rose and fell in jagged ridges and ravines. Volcanic rock made digging difficult. Every piece of cover was contested. The Japanese defensive system grew more elaborate the further north the Marines advanced, with more tunnels, more bunkers, more interlocking positions. Supply lines stretched thin. The distance from the beaches to the forward positions grew from hundreds of yards to thousands. Each day the Marines advanced a little further, and each day it became more difficult to get food, water, and ammunition to them. Water was especially critical. The volcanic rock absorbed nothing. There were no streams, no wells, no natural water sources. Every drop had to be carried forward in 5-gallon cans, and even then the water was warm, tasted of metal, and had to be carefully rationed. By February 25th, 6 days after the initial landing, 2nd Battalion's supply situation had become critical. They had been in continuous combat for nearly a week. They had suffered heavy casualties, with some rifle platoons reduced to half strength or less. They had advanced several thousand yards from the beach through some of the most difficult terrain on the island, and they were running out of food. The official supply records showed that rations had been sent forward, but somewhere in the chaos of beach operations and movement inland, those rations had not reached the men who needed them. Perhaps they had been diverted to units with more urgent needs. Perhaps they had been destroyed by artillery fire on the beach. Perhaps they were sitting in some dump area waiting for transportation that never came. The reason did not matter. The result was the same. The The men were hungry, and conventional rations were not arriving. The moment of revelation came gradually, then suddenly, like many transformations in combat. It began on the morning of February 26th, when 2nd Battalion received orders to attack a Japanese position designated Hill 362 Able, a volcanic ridge that dominated the approach to the island's central highlands. The attack would require the battalion to advance across open ground, climb steep slopes under fire, and assault fortified positions. It would require physical strength, sustained effort, and the ability to function under extreme stress for hours without pause. The Marines who assembled for the attack had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days. Some men had a few crackers saved from earlier rations. Some had candy bars or packets of instant coffee. Most had nothing except water, and even that was limited to half a canteen per man. They were exhausted from days of continuous fighting, filthy from the volcanic ash that covered everything, and weak from lack of food and sleep. Staff Sergeant Burmeister appeared at the assembly area carrying metal containers filled with his mixture. He moved from squad to squad, using a large serving spoon to scoop portions into mess kits, canteen cups, or whatever containers the men had. The Marines looked at the thick brownish paste with disgust. It looked worse than it had when freshly made. The components had merged together into a uniform consistency that resembled nothing so much as the mud at the bottom of a drainage ditch. But they were hungry enough to try it. One corporal, a man named Eddie Slovic from Pittsburgh, took a cautious taste. His expression suggested he was eating something scraped off a latrine floor, but he swallowed. He took another spoonful. He finished what Burmeister had given him, scraping his mess kit clean with his fingers. "Tastes like every bad thing in the war mixed together," he said, "but it fills you up." Other men followed his example. They ate Burmeister's mixture because they had nothing else and because they needed food before the attack. They ate it quickly, without taking time to think about the taste or appearance. They washed it down with water from their canteens, and then they moved out toward Hill 362 Able, expecting to be hungry and weak within hours. They were not. The mixture, as revolting as it tasted and looked, provided sustained energy in a way that normal C-rations did not. The high-calorie density meant that a small volume of food provided substantial nutrition. The mixture of different ration components, which seemed random and stupid, actually created a balance of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates that sustained physical effort for extended periods. The thick consistency meant it digested slowly, releasing energy over hours rather than minutes. Marines who had eaten Burmeister's mixture reported that they felt full, genuinely full, for the first time in days. They did not experience the hunger pangs that usually returned within hours of eating C-rations. They did not feel the weakness and lightheadedness that came from inadequate nutrition. They could function, physically and mentally, through hours of combat that should have left them exhausted. The attack on Hill 362, Able, lasted throughout February 26th and into the 27th. It was brutal, exhausting work. Marines climbed volcanic slopes under machine gun fire, assaulted bunkers with flamethrowers and explosives, fought through interconnected tunnel systems where Japanese soldiers appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Men were killed and wounded at rates that would have destroyed less determined units. But the survivors kept fighting, kept moving, kept functioning because they had the physical energy to do so. A lieutenant named Robert Leader, commanding a rifle platoon in the attack, later wrote in his journal about the experience. His men had eaten Burmeister's mixture before the attack. They had complained bitterly about the taste. But during the fighting, Leader noticed that his Marines were performing better than they had in previous days. They were not collapsing from exhaustion as quickly. They were not making the kind of mistakes that came from mental fog caused by hunger. They were staying alert, responsive, capable of following orders and making decisions even after hours of continuous combat. By the end of February, word of Burmeister's mixture had spread beyond 2nd Battalion. Other units in the 5th Marine Division heard about the cook who had created something that kept men fighting when conventional rations ran short. Supply officers, initially skeptical and concerned about regulatory violations, began to see the practical value. When resupply failed, when beaches were under fire, when transportation broke down, having a food source that was portable, calorie-dense, and quick to consume made the difference between combat effectiveness and collapse. The mixture began to be produced in larger quantities. Other cooks, following Burmeister's example, took their units' C-rations and combined them in similar ways. The proportions varied. Some cooks added more crackers to thicken the paste. Others emphasized the meat components for protein. A few experimented with heating the mixture, though this required fuel and time that were often unavailable. But the basic principle remained constant. Combine maximum calories in minimum volume, create something that could be eaten quickly under combat conditions, and accept that taste was irrelevant compared to functionality. The official Marine Corps supply system never formally adopted Burmeister's mixture. There were no regulations written authorizing it. No Quartermaster Corps study validated its nutritional content. No manual described proper preparation procedures. It remained an unofficial field expedient, something that individual cooks did when circumstances required it and officers permitted it. This lack of official recognition meant that its use varied widely between units and campaigns. Some commanders prohibited the practice, insisting that rations be issued and consumed according to regulations. They argued that the Quartermaster Corps had designed the rations carefully, and that field modifications risked creating nutritional deficiencies or health problems. They worried about accountability, about how to track ration consumption when components were being mixed together rather than issued individually. They were correct that Burmeister's mixture violated standard procedures, but they were wrong about its effectiveness. Other commanders, particularly those who had experienced the supply difficulties on Iwo Jima, quietly encouraged their cooks to prepare similar mixtures when circumstances warranted. They recognized that regulations written in Washington or tested at stateside facilities did not always account for the realities of Pacific Island combat. They understood that a man who could eat quickly and return to fighting was more valuable than a man who was following proper ration consumption procedures but was too hungry or exhausted to function effectively, Lieutenant. Colonel Chandler Johnson, who commanded 2nd Battalion, 28th Regiment, was among the officers who supported Burmeister's innovation. Johnson was a practical officer, focused on keeping his men alive and combat effective rather than on following regulations for their own sake. He had seen the results. His battalion had sustained combat operations for days longer than should have been possible, given the supply situation. His men had maintained their physical strength and mental alertness under conditions that should have degraded their performance severely. When questioned by higher headquarters about the irregular ration preparation, Johnson reportedly said that he did not care what his cook did as long as the men could fight. Johnson was killed on March 2nd during fighting in the central highlands of Iwo Jima. He was struck by an artillery shell while observing Japanese positions. His death was one of thousands, one more casualty in a battle that consumed men with terrible efficiency. But before he died, he had ensured that Burmeister received recognition within the battalion. He mentioned the cook's contribution in reports. He made certain other officers knew that the mixture had been crucial to the battalion's sustained operations. It was not a medal or an official commendation, but it was acknowledgment from a respected commander that innovation and practical thinking mattered as much as following regulations. Burmeister continued serving as a cook throughout the remainder of the Iwo Jima campaign. The island was declared secure on March 26th. though fighting continued in isolated pockets for days afterward. Total Marine casualties exceeded 26,000 men, with nearly 7,000 dead. It was the costliest battle in Marine Corps history, measured by casualties per day of fighting. Japanese casualties were approximately 21,000, with only a few hundred taken prisoner. Almost the entire garrison had fought to the death in the underground defensive positions. After Iwo Jima, Burmeister remained with the 5th Marine Division as it regrouped and prepared for the planned invasion of Japan. He trained new replacements who had joined the division to replace the casualties from Iwo. He continued preparing meals, sometimes using his mixture when circumstances required it, sometimes returning to conventional ration preparation when supplies were adequate. He wrote letters home to his wife in Milwaukee, mentioning nothing about the mixture because he did not consider it particularly significant. He had solved a practical problem using common sense and cooking experience. That seemed unremarkable to him, even if it had kept men alive. The story of Burmeister's mixture illuminates a larger truth about military logistics in World War II. The official systems, carefully designed and tested in peacetime conditions, often failed to account for the chaos and variability of combat. Regulations assumed that supply lines would function, that transportation would be available, that men would have time and equipment to prepare meals properly. Reality frequently contradicted those assumptions. The Pacific Theater presented particularly difficult logistical challenges. Islands had no local food sources, no infrastructure, no facilities for supporting large military forces. Everything had to be brought by ship from bases thousands of miles away. Every item, from bullets to bandages to food, competed for limited cargo space and transportation assets. Priority systems determined what moved first, and food often ranked below ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies. The standard C-ration, for all its careful design, was optimized for conditions that rarely existed in forward combat areas. It assumed men would have time to open cans, heat contents, and eat at a measured pace. It assumed vehicles would be available to transport the relatively heavy and bulky ration cans. It assumed that tactical situations would permit regular meals at predictable intervals. These assumptions held true in rear areas and base camps. They broke down completely in places like Iwo Jima, where every square yard was contested, and where survival depended on moving, fighting, and functioning under continuous pressure. Burmeister's innovation addressed these realities. His mixture was not elegant or appetizing, but it worked under conditions where conventional approaches failed. It provided maximum nutrition in minimum volume. It required no preparation time or equipment. It could be eaten in seconds rather than minutes. These practical advantages outweighed any aesthetic or regulatory concerns when men's lives depended on maintaining combat effectiveness. The mixture also represented a form of tactical flexibility that characterized American military operations in World War II. The United States military, for all its emphasis on regulations and procedures, generally permitted and even encouraged practical innovation at lower levels. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers had authority to adapt official methods to local conditions. This decentralization of decision-making created redundancy and resilience in military operations. When official systems failed, individuals could improvise solutions. German and Japanese military organizations, by contrast, tended to be more rigid in their adherence to doctrine. Officers were trained to follow established procedures and were often reluctant to deviate even when circumstances changed. This rigidity created vulnerabilities. When supply lines were disrupted, when equipment failed, when situations developed that had not been anticipated in planning, German and Japanese units often struggled to adapt. Their soldiers were disciplined and brave, but they lacked the institutional flexibility that allowed American forces to improvise effectively. The contrast was visible in small details like food preparation and in larger strategic decisions. American forces adapted their tactics, modified their equipment, changed their plans when reality demanded it. They did not always make the right decisions, but they made decisions and implemented them quickly. This organizational flexibility, combined with overwhelming material superiority, created a military force that could absorb setbacks, learn from mistakes, and continue operations even when original plans had failed. Burmeister's mixture was a microscopic example of this larger pattern. A single cook, working with limited resources under difficult conditions, had identified a problem and implemented a solution without waiting for official authorization. His innovation had kept his unit combat effective when conventional approaches would have failed, and his example had spread informally through the division, as other cooks recognized the practical value and adapted the technique to their own circumstances. There were thousands of similar innovations throughout the American military in World War II. Soldiers modified weapons to function better in specific environments. Engineers improvised bridges and roads from whatever materials were available. Maintenance crews kept vehicles running with improvised repairs when proper replacement parts were unavailable. Communications personnel rigged radio systems to work under conditions that should have made them inoperable. These individual acts of practical problem-solving, multiplied across millions of service members, created a military organization that was remarkably adaptable and resilient. The official histories rarely mention these small innovations. They focus on major battles, strategic decisions, technological developments, and the actions of senior commanders. But wars are won or lost based on countless small factors, many of them mundane and unspectacular. Whether men have adequate food, whether vehicles can traverse difficult terrain, whether communications function reliably, whether equipment can be repaired in the field. These prosaic concerns determine combat effectiveness as much as brilliant strategy or advanced technology. Staff Sergeant Louis Burmeister returned to Milwaukee after the war ended in August 1945. He was discharged from the Marine Corps in November, having served 3 years and accumulated enough points under the demobilization system to qualify for early separation. He returned to work at the same diner on Mitchell Street where he had been employed before the war. He married his longtime girlfriend in December 1945. He lived a quiet civilian life, working as a cook, raising a family, participating in his local Veterans of Foreign Wars post. He rarely spoke about his time in the Marines. This was common among veterans of his generation, men who had experienced terrible things and had no desire to relive them through storytelling. When he did mention the war, it was usually in response to direct questions from family members or other veterans. He would describe locations, mention friends who had not returned, occasionally recall specific incidents. But he never portrayed himself as heroic, or his service as particularly significant. He never mentioned the mixture. In his mind, it was not worth discussing. He had been a cook doing his job, solving a practical problem with the tools and knowledge available to him. That other men had found it useful was satisfying, but not remarkable. He had not won a battle or saved lives in some dramatic fashion. He had simply made food that men could eat when conventional rations were unavailable. This seemed to him a minor accomplishment, barely worth remembering compared to the sacrifices of men who had been killed or who had performed acts of genuine heroism under fire. This perspective was characteristic of many veterans who had contributed to victory through technical skill, logistical support, or administrative competence rather than through combat heroics. The culture valued infantry courage, the men who had charged enemy positions with rifles and grenades. It valued pilots who had shot down enemy aircraft, sailors who had fought in naval battles, officers who had made tactical decisions under pressure. It was less interested in cooks, mechanics, clerks, and the thousands of other support personnel whose work made combat operations possible. But the reality was that wars depended on these unglamorous contributions as much as on battlefield courage. An army without food could not fight, regardless of how brave its soldiers were. Equipment that broke down and could not be repaired became useless metal. Supplies that could not be transported to where they were needed might as well not exist. Communications that failed left units isolated and unable to coordinate. Every aspect of military operations depended on thousands of people performing mundane tasks competently under difficult conditions. Burmeister's mixture represented this larger truth. It was not glamorous or officially recognized. It violated regulations and appeared disgusting, but it worked when and where it was needed. It kept men fighting when they should have been weak from hunger. It provided the physical energy necessary for combat operations to continue when supply lines had failed. It was a small thing, easily overlooked, but it mattered to the men who ate it and survived battles they might not have otherwise survived. The Marines who had cursed Burmeister's cooking on that February afternoon in 1945 had not understood what they were looking at. They had seen something that violated their expectations of what food should be. They had not seen a practical solution to an urgent problem. They had not recognized that their cook understood the supply situation better than they did and had acted to keep them alive. Their dismissal of the mixture as stupid or garbage was based on appearance and taste, not on functionality or necessity. This was a common pattern in military innovation. New ideas, particularly those that violated established procedures or aesthetic expectations, faced resistance from people who valued traditional approaches. The mixture looked wrong, therefore it must be wrong, regardless of whether it actually worked. This kind of reasoning had hampered military adaptation throughout history. Equipment that looked unusual was rejected even when it performed better. Tactics that violated doctrine were criticized even when they produced victories. Soldiers and officers often preferred familiar failure to unfamiliar success. But wars create pressures that force adaptation. Organizations that cannot adjust to changing circumstances lose. Individuals who cannot innovate when official systems fail become casualties or liabilities. The American military in World War II, for all its bureaucracy and regulations, generally managed to permit enough flexibility at lower levels that practical innovations like Burmeister's mixture could emerge, spread informally, and contribute to overall effectiveness even without official approval. The story circles back to where it began, on the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, with Marines staring at a mixture they considered revolting. They had been wrong to dismiss it. It was not stupid or pointless. It was precisely what they needed, created by a man who understood their situation better than they did themselves. Within days, they would realize this. Some would thank Burmeister. Others would simply eat what he provided without comment, grateful for the physical strength that allowed them to survive battles that killed thousands of their fellow Marines. The mixture itself was forgotten after the war. It was never standardized, never incorporated into official ration design, never recognized in military histories or official documentation. Burmeister received no decoration, no official commendation, no recognition beyond the informal thanks of men who had eaten it and survived. He died in 1973 in Milwaukee, having lived a long and quiet life. His obituary mentioned his military service, but contained no details about what he had done or why it had mattered. But for a few weeks in February and March of 1945, on an 8-square-mile volcanic island in the Pacific Ocean, his innovation had made a difference. Men had fought and survived who might otherwise have collapsed from hunger and exhaustion. A battalion had sustained combat operations when conventional logistics would have failed. Small acts had accumulated into something significant, even if no one outside that time and place would ever know or care. This was the reality of war, beneath the grand narratives of strategy and heroism. It was people solving immediate problems with whatever tools they had. It was practical thinking under terrible pressure. It was the accumulation of thousands of small decisions and actions that determined who lived and who died, who succeeded and who failed. And sometimes it was a cook mixing together rations that everyone agreed looked and tasted terrible, creating something that worked precisely because he understood what was needed, rather than what was wanted. The Marines had learned this lesson, though many would not have articulated it in those terms. They had learned that appearance and regulations mattered less than functionality. They had learned that sometimes the right answer looked wrong. They had learned that survival depended on people who thought practically rather than conventionally. And they had learned to trust the judgment of a 31-year-old cook from Milwaukee who had made something stupid that kept them alive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.